Greetings, beautiful people. Welcome to Video Chat 8, a discussion of Metzgar's Part 3, which includes chapters 5 and 6, his final two chapters, entitled Remembering or Not. And speaking of remembering, I have my special commemorative Dodger cap on for Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color line in April of 1947. So, gotta represent. Remembering is important, and he starts off his prologue by discussing the 100th anniversary of the famous Homestead Steel Strike, and he's attending a commemoration, and he almost feels like shouting, what does it matter? What difference does it make? Because by the 1990s, labor was in decline in the United States. Labor was in retreat. Union membership was in decline. And corporations were, taking the driver's seat more than ever. And so I think it's out of frustration that it propelled him to write this book. And he also comes to a realization that day, during that commemoration of Homestead, that he realizes why it matters. And he starts talking about his father's generation, the generation that founded the United Steelworkers and built a better life for themselves and their families. And he realizes, he says, that that is one generation of workers that was not what he calls noble victims. They actually helped shape the country's history. And he also realizes that it made a difference to his generation. He says, my generation, didn't have to scratch and claw quite as much because we had the benefits of what his father's generation had fought for. But finally, he says, his nieces and nephews, the next generation, they don't have it so good, and they're not going to have it so good. And so he places this importance of remembering in the context of what happens when we don't remember stuff. And he finishes it off with a quote on page 154 that I'd like to read to you. And he says, the lesson of not forgetting has a broader application. Disciplined collective action in its many different forms is an important part of American history, and it has achieved quite a lot in the past 50 years. In fact, grassroots action by ordinary people probably gained more in that 50 years than in any other half century in human history. Forgetting that impoverishes our future and disables us from making it. And I want to repeat that last sentence again. Forgetting that impoverishes our future and disables us from making it. And I think what he's trying to say here is that when we forget the struggles and that collective struggles by ordinary people can make a difference, we disempower ourselves. We're living in a moment in history when workers are really suffering. And if we don't think that collective action matters, if we think that we're all just fated to lose, and so you better just look out for yourself, if that's what we remember, then we disempower ourselves. So the importance of this history couldn't be more relevant for all of us, regardless of race, gender, or station in life, that we're not fated to live in a world where oppression and exploitation is the norm. It can be challenged, and it can change, and the only way to do it is through collective action by ordinary people coming together. It's that old lesson of solidarity. So let's look at chapters 5 and 6. Okay, So, chapter 5 is discussing why the working class didn't remember this time. I mean, why was it that we don't have a stronger working class memory of these struggles? Part of it, of course, is that our education system doesn't teach labor history, that our media doesn't reflect that. But what about the oral culture of the working class? Why wasn't that more vibrant in passing along these stories? And he has a theory about that in chapter 5, which really forms the center of that chapter. And it goes along these lines. First, there was a divided memory among workers of these victories because eventually the Union had to retreat. So there was no unified memory for the Union members themselves. Secondly, he spends a good part of the middle of the chapter talking about the fact that the Union itself didn't have a unified memory of these events. For one thing, there was an upsurge of protest within the Union, a group called the Dues Protesters, who were protesting the raising of Union dues. And so there was a lot of bitter feeling within the Union, and you didn't have a unified memory of that. There's also divided leadership. Union leadership went through a series of challenges in the late 60s and 70s, often bitter struggles between rival factions of Union leaders. And so there's no kind of unified narrative among Union members or Union leaders about the role of the Union and its successes. And this is part of the reason that it made it easier for the professional middle class to substitute a narrative about Union failure in the absence of any kind of unified Union culture of remembering. And then finally, the last third of the chapter talks about his own father. And this is a very interesting kind of autobiographical section of the chapter. And several things happened to his father, including his father's own disputes with the Union over certain rules about grievances. Secondly, is his children's and his wife's own rebellion against his authority and privilege. And it's kind of interesting here that I think what Metzger is getting at is that working class white men like Johnny Metzger in the 1960s and 70s faced rebellion to their own privilege as white males. Rebellion from the youth, rebellion from women who weren't going to take a subordinate position even in the household anymore. And his own mother is an example of this. And then thirdly, the civil rights movement, which challenged white privilege. And it's very interesting, the passages that Metzger talks about his father being somewhat threatened by the civil rights movement, feeling that the civil rights movement had gone too far and things like that. And it is kind of an interesting window into that generation of working class white men and how many of them became Reagan Democrats in the 1980s. Their sense of race and gender privilege had been challenged. And if we think back to the early part of Metzger's book, remember he talks about the fact that these Union struggles and these Union victories taught whole communities that, hey, stick together and you can challenge authority. So ironically, what happens is that some of these white men don't like the fact that their cultural authority as white men was being challenged in the 60s and 70s. And so they sort of retreat to conservatism. And I think it's a very interesting insight about about what happens to memory and also a sense of class consciousness and a sense of rebellion against authority as white male working class members of society kind of retreated to a more conservative social position. Nevertheless, I think there's an interesting quote at the end of the chapter that reveals that despite all this, his father still, after discussing it with his son, remembers how much the Union meant to him. And if we look on page 201, take a moment to find that passage at the very end of the chapter, page 201, he quotes his father. "You can say what you want about the Union, but Stan and me and lots of others would have been thrown on the scrap heap without it. I saw them do it to the old guys in the 30s. In the end, Yock couldn't do whatever he wanted. The Union couldn't do everything we wanted either. But it gave you something to work with, something to keep you from being on your knees, begging for mercy. It might seem like a little thing to you, but to me, it was everything." And he's talking about a showdown with his supervisor named Yock over a machine called the hot rod, which was a very tricky machine to work, and there were only a few guys in the shop floor who knew how to work it. And in the end, Johnny walks off the job because he's got a pension, because he can afford to say, you know what, screw you. If you're going to make me, work this machine all alone and put all that pressure on me, I'm just going to quit. And having a union pension enabled him to do that. And it gave him a measure of dignity. It didn't mean the union had all the power. See, this is the thing. It just meant dignity, a basic level of dignity. And management had to accommodate that, which management never likes to do. So there's a lesson in there about the importance of the dignity of work that shines through despite the forgetting. The one thing that Johnny didn't forget was that the union made basic dignity possible. All right, so let's look now at Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is called The Contest for Official Memory. And what it's really about is how the professional middle class takes on a very large role in shaping our cultural memory and shaping our cultural views. At the beginning of this section, part 3, in the prologue, Metzgar talks about Robert Samuelson, who's an author who writes a book about the economy of the United States. And Metzgar finds it very revealing that Samuelson doesn't give the unions any credit for the prosperity of the 50s and 60s, but gives the unions all the blame when the economy turns south in the 70s. And there's a bias there. There's a middle-class bias that he sees in the way that labor is talked about, in the way it's remembered. And so Chapter 6 is really about how the professional middle class shaped our memory of labor and its struggles, and maybe misshaped that memory too, and why it's important to recapture the importance of the working class to American history and the importance of collective struggle to American history. He notes that the professional middle class has its own way of seeing the world, and you're often socialized to that way of seeing the world, by the way, in college. You're socialized to strive. It's about individual achievement. It's about wanting to stand out from others. And he sees this as a different worldview, a different way of seeing the world, a way of seeing the world through the lens of individual achievement, not collective action. And he also notes that the professional middle class has an outsized role in shaping the way history is written, the way the news is written, and you don't have often working class voices giving a different point of view. So it shapes what's remembered and how it's remembered. I was thinking about this recently. You know, I can remember not too long ago discussions with friends, colleagues during a grocery workers' strike. Um, and one of the common refrains was, well, hey, if they want more money, meaning grocery workers, they should get a job somewhere else. They should go back to school and just get a job somewhere else. And I find it very interesting that in a moment of crisis, we're suddenly seeing the value of grocery workers who literally, in many cases, are risking their lives to keep store shelves stocked with food and keep food delivered to the houses of professional middle class people. And I think it's important to remember that this is, maybe what this crisis is revealing is that essential workers are often the lowest paid workers. Maybe they deserve more pay, benefits, and better working conditions. And the only way they're going to get that, this history suggests, is through collective struggle. And I think it's important for all of us, even those of us who are in the professional middle class, even when you graduate and you hopefully become a member of the professional middle class, that you don't forget that just because someone does a wage earning job does not mean they are less than you. And that the basic dignity of work is the job of unions, and that unions have an important role to play in our society, and that it's important not to forget that. And I think that's one of the central lessons of this book, and one that it teaches us rather well. I hope you've enjoyed the book. I hope you are enjoying it and are getting something out of it. We'll talk more about it when we review for our final exam, but I think that I hope it's opening your eyes to a way of questioning the dominant narratives about unions in our society, and to approach them with some skepticism and understand that those narratives are often shaped by middle class people who have a class perspective. And that class perspective is different than a working class perspective. And remembering that distinction is very important. All right. Thank you.